You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 28th of April 2025 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, broadcasting live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's programme.
I know that I join all Canadians in mourning with you. I know that Canadians are united with you. Tout le Canada est avec vous.
Canada goes to the polls as Vancouver reels from a devastating attack on a street festival. We'll have the latest with our correspondent in Canada. After that, we explore why North Korea has now confirmed what everybody knew to be the case. Its soldiers are fighting alongside Russia against Ukraine. We'll ask whether Israel's ceasefire with Hezbollah in the north can hold, and later on in the show.
They feel trusted. And I think that's the number one currency these days, trust. And that's what we're trying to do by building community.
We speak to a star Indonesian broadcaster, Najwa Shihab, and we ask why members of the African Union are joining forces to go into space. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. North Korea has finally confirmed the obvious, that its soldiers have been fighting alongside Russian soldiers against Ukraine. North Korea's Central Military Commission celebrated the liberation of Russia's Kursk region and very much touted Russia's line that they were fighting neo-Nazi Ukrainian occupiers. The Chief of Staff of Russia's armed forces has also celebrated North Korean soldiers as heroes in return. Well, I'm joined now by John Everard, former British ambassador to North Korea and Belarus. John, there is no surprise at North Korean troops' presence. Is there surprise in the acknowledgement of their presence?
There's no surprise that they've finally done it. I think the pressure was building, and the myth that only slanders and lies were telling the world that the North Koreans were in Russia. The big question is why they've done it now. And I think there are two big theories. One is that this is all to do with the delicate minuet, the peace negotiations over Ukraine, orchestrated or not by the United States, and that somehow Russia is trying to build the North Korean presence into the negotiations. The other is we have the May the 9th Liberation Day parade coming up in Russia, and some people are suggesting that we may actually see North Korean troops at that parade. So for that to happen, of course, you've got formally to acknowledge that they've been fighting the Ukrainians.
That is quite an incredible thing to imagine happening in a week or so. But, I mean, this may be a propaganda play in some ways, both for Russia's interests and also perhaps for North Korea's interests. How beneficial or damaging has this deployment, though, really been for North Korea?
Well, let's start with the pros. Firstly, North Korea has undoubtedly learnt a great deal about modern warfare. It's learned that its soldiers were unable to cope with modern drones, that their formations, the way they fought their battles, were all wrong. But they've learnt those lessons, and last weekend, the senior Ukrainian general was saying that the North Koreans had become really very effective troops. Also, of course, there's what North Korea's been getting in exchange for this deployment. Russia has delivered, we don't know the numbers, but clearly very large amounts of grain, oil, and other goodies to the faltering North Korean economy. On the debit side, the casualties have been shocking. Nobody knows quite how many wounded, but 3,000-4,000 dead probably out of a deployment of maybe 12, some say 15,000, and an awful lot of very, very badly shaken North Korean troops. One of the interesting aspects of what the North Koreans are saying is going to build a monument to the soldiers who fought in Russia, which goes some way to solving their problem about what to do with the wounded. The dead, you see, are relatively easy. You simply send the ashes back and you put up a tombstone, which they said that they'll do. But it's now official that these wounded soldiers, horrible that their injuries are, terrible that the things they are they've seen, are heroes. They will get medals and their families will be honoured. It takes the North Korean regime off the hook for quite a big political dilemma.
And this comes, as you suggested as well, John, that around the time that Vladimir Putin might, and I stress might here, be facing some pressure also from the US and from Trump to halt his attacks on Ukraine and agree a ceasefire. Is it possible that Putin is, together with this move with North Korea, sort of consolidating, celebrating achievements, and that there might be a halt coming?
We would love to think so, wouldn't we? Well, look, quick, Chris, the answer is yes, there's hope, but we've had so many false dawns in these negotiations that I, for one, am keeping my champagne on ice.
And, I mean, well, partly the reason for that, I suppose, John, is that the US, as ever, is also sending mixed messages, isn't it? Donald Trump wants Putin to stop, but Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, also suggests the US might stop caring. Could Putin just sort of ride this out?
Yes, and I think quite a few people on Putin's right wing, to which he's extremely vulnerable, would be urging him to do exactly this, to tap the Americans along, to use President Trump's phrase, until they give up, they get bored with the idea of a peace deal. President Trump recognizes that he's not going to get his Nobel Peace Prize that way, and Putin is effectively given a free hand to keep grinding on in Ukraine. Nobody really knows what Putin's end game in all this is. But I suspect that given half the chance, if he were able to grind right through and take the majority of Ukraine, he'd do so. And of course, in all this, North Korean troops are vital. One point that flows from this, Chris, the North Korean statement that came out this morning, I think, echoing what the Russians have said, talks about the conclusion of the operations, suggesting that that part of the North Korean deployment to this war is over. It's not clear whether we're going to see continued North Korean activity in Ukrainian territory, for example. The Ukrainians have said that they think the North Koreans may be trying to advance towards Sumy, or whether the troops will go back home. Watch this space.
John Everard, I'm sure we'll speak with you again about that. Thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio, and now it's time for Monica Lillis with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. The South Korean government has ruled out that Seoul would agree to a trade package with Washington ahead of the country's snap presidential election in June. This comes after the two nations' first formal tariff talks last week. According to political analysts, it would be difficult for South Korea to make any firm commitments with an acting president in power. Saudi Arabia and Qatar have said they will settle Syria's outstanding debt to the World Bank in a move to unlock development funds for the war-torn country. The financing of around €13.2 million will be the first monetary assistance from Riyadh since the fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime last year. A man has been rescued from Mount Fuji twice in the last week. The Chinese student who lives in Japan was first rescued on Tuesday whilst on the Fuji-no-Maya Trail and was unable to descend. However, he returned to the mountain days later to retrieve his phone but got stuck again. Due to harsh conditions, people are discouraged from climbing Mount Fuji outside of the official climbing season that starts in early July. Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Monica. Now, Canada's federal elections take place today, and while the past few weeks have been turned on their head by a trade war and broader threats from the US President Donald Trump, the final day was turned on its head by an attack in Vancouver. At least 11 people were killed when a car drove into a crowd at a Filipino street festival in the city on Saturday evening. A 33-year-old has been charged with 8 counts of second-degree murder. And joining me now is Monocle's Toronto correspondent, Tomos Lewis. Thomas, thanks for coming on, as ever, to the show. What can you tell us about this Vancouver attack, first of all, and sort of how it's impacted the mood and everything around this race?
Well, in terms of the mood, Chris, the shock has been pretty palpable, I think it's fair to say, far beyond Vancouver. This street festival, the Lapu Lapu Day Festival, is an annual sort of fixture in the calendar, in the street festival calendar in Vancouver. And we see festivals like these that are a pretty common sight in cities right across the country and a pretty popular part of city life as well, especially as the the weather begins to get better. But this attack appears to have been launched at about 8 p.m. local time on Saturday. As you said, the police say that 11 people have been killed, more than 20 patients injured, were taken to hospitals in the area. And, you know, as you say, there is an election happening in Canada today, and even one of the major party leaders, Jagmeet Singh of the New Democratic Party, was at this festival just shortly before the attack happened, and he gave an address appearing to be pretty shaken, to be honest, expressing his grief to those who'd been killed. But, you know, I think it gives a sense that this has really sort of had an effect on all kind of tiers of life in Vancouver and across the country too, that it's chimed a big sense of shock with.
And Thomas, is there a way in which it has impacted the race more broadly? I mean, this is sort of the mood and this is what will happen after an attack. But in terms of, I don't know, the politics of it or anything like that, how are the candidates speaking about this moment?
I think in terms of how voters sort of might see this awful event in relation to the votes they'll be making today, it might be a little bit soon, Chris, and might feel a little bit separate, but all of the candidates, as you'd expect, have made statements and have changed the final hours of their campaign plans. Mark Carney, the Prime Minister, he went to the site last night to lay some flowers alongside the Premier of British Columbia, and he changed some of the bigger rallies he was meant to be doing in parts of the country to reflect kind of just how shocked people feel about the events on Saturday night. But I think, you know, what we are seeing today is potentially a very high turnout in a vote that really for many Canadians has felt like an extraordinary one, and one with sort of very little precedent. And I did go to a rally last week in British Columbia, Chris, to speak to supporters of the Prime Minister, Mark Carney. And I spoke to one attendee, Pamela Rose. She's a retired teacher. And we can hear her now, I think, just as a sort of a summary, really, of kind of what you hear quite regularly from those people who say they will be voting for the Liberal Party under Mark Carney a little later today.
I'm inspired by the prospect of having Mark Carney as a continuing Prime Minister. I very much respect what he's written, his values, experience, clarity, and so just here for support.
The manoeuvres of the US against Canada's economy, how big a factor is that playing into how you feel about Mark Carney and how he's doing?
It's a very big factor, and I don't think it's going to go away. So in terms of tackling the challenges ahead, I think that I don't see anybody else on the horizon, actually, who's able to give that kind of perspective, guidance, encouragement. And it's going to need a lot of people who are working together and who recognize that the change that's happening is probably one that's not going to be pleasant in many ways. And so we have to be strong. And Mr. Carney is coming at it just when we really, really need somebody who's not fresh to this kind of work, but fresh to this particular position. And also, it's a big position. Consequences are huge. He's ready for that.
Tomos, to hear comments like that from a rally of Mark Carney for a party that was dead in the water just a few months ago, is it an oversimplification to say that this is all down to Donald Trump?
I think it's a little bit of a simplification, Chris. It's probably more down to three events of which Donald Trump, the return of the president in the US for a second term, is one of them. I think you have to go back to January when Justin Trudeau, who'd really become historically unpopular, finally decided to resign. In the opinion polls, you start to see support, a kind of a pressure valve sort of in support for the Liberal Party release a little bit. But then when Donald Trump returns to the White House and then the ascendancy of Mark Carney, you really see this turnaround really pick up speed. And I think, you know, if you look at the history of Canadian polling, Chris, this is one of the biggest swings in the history of opinion polling in Canada. And as you rightly say, even as recently as January, this would have been dismissed as fantasy, the idea that the Liberal Party could even, be talked about possibly forming a majority government, which, as we saw on Sunday, the latest opinion polls before Election Day, that does seem to be the most likeliest, the most likely scenario, come Election Day today, and when the results are revealed later this evening. It's also an extraordinary story, just briefly, Chris, for the Conservative Party of Canada, because they were sitting on a 24-point lead in the opinion polls right back at the beginning of the year, and had enjoyed that kind of level of support for about at least a year or 18 months. So I think what's kind of interesting to see, whatever happens later today when the results come in, is whether the Conservative Party, having struggled to pivot their message as the national mood was roiled by President Trump, and having failed to really sort of, read the room in terms of that and make that central to their campaign, how deeply that will have cost them, and how deeply as well kind of other issues that seem set in stone really at the beginning of the year have been sort of overshadowed by Donald Trump and what his presidency means for Canada in the years ahead. So it'll be a really fascinating set of results to watch as they come through later today, Chris.
Tomos Lewis, our Toronto correspondent, thank you very much for joining us. We will, of course, have more from Canada's elections in our shows later on today and tomorrow as well. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. This is The Briefing. I'm Chris Chermak. Since the end of a ceasefire with Hamas, Israel's war on Gaza has continued unabated in the past few weeks, but its northern border with Lebanon had been comparatively quiet, thanks to a US-brokered ceasefire with Hezbollah that had largely held. On Sunday, however, Israel struck a building in southern Beirut that the army claimed was being used to store precision missiles in violation of the ceasefire agreement. Lebanon's president has condemned the attack and called on the international guarantors to intervene. Well, I'm joined now on the line by Hannah Davis, journalist based in Beirut. Hannah, what can you tell us about Sunday's attack?
Hi, thank you for having me. Yeah, so yesterday's attack happened in the afternoon, and the evacuation order came just about an hour before Israel hit Beirut's southern suburbs. And once again, it sent a wave of panic through the neighborhood. You had people, gathering their belongings, running out of their houses, rushing to their cars, trying to escape the area as soon as possible. And it really provoked among residents a lot of memories of when Beirut's southern suburbs were heavily bombed last fall. But I wouldn't say this attack necessarily came as a surprise. Notably, this was the third Israeli strike on Beirut in the past month. So we've been seeing this. It wasn't necessarily unexpected. These near daily Israeli strikes have been continuing in South Lebanon since the ceasefire on November 27th.
Now, Israel claims that this munition store violates the ceasefire agreement. Lebanon's president is claiming Israel has violated the ceasefire and wants the US and France as the guarantors to intervene. Is any intervention likely at this point?
Yeah, I think it is likely. I will say, I think, there's a lot of pressure right now on Lebanon to address Hezbollah's weapons stockpiles. And I think the army is really doing its best. And we're seeing, the army, the news in the south, they're going south and they're destroying Hezbollah's weapons. And they're really trying their best to destroy the weapons stockpiles. But, we're not seeing a stop of Israeli strikes on Lebanon as well. And these are happening near daily. And Hezbollah is saying that, they're not going to disarm until Israel withdraws from the 5 outposts that they're still stationed at in South Lebanon.
Well, and in addition to that from Hezbollah, the question, I suppose, as well, is whether they want this ceasefire to continue, considering the war in Gaza has picked up again, because that, after all, was also the initial impetus for Hezbollah launching strikes against Israel. What's your sense of that?
So I think now really what we're seeing is the war in Gaza is kind of detached at this point from the war in Lebanon. I think Hezbollah has lost a lot of its deterrence. I don't think, so I don't think we're going to see a resumption of the fighting that we saw last fall, the really heavy fighting between Hezbollah and Israel. I don't think Hezbollah has the capacity to do this. I mean, it's been its top chains of command have been wiped out. It's, the southern villages where it draws most of its support are completely destroyed. No one has the interest in resuming a war like we saw in the fall. So I don't think it's likely that we're going to see a resumption of heavy fighting. However, we might see, there could be the possibility of minor strikes, but I doubt it, honestly.
And give us then a bit more of a sense of how the Lebanese government is involved here. Have they gained, in part perhaps because of, as you suggest, Hezbollah losing a lot of its key leadership and strike capabilities? Has the Lebanese government and military sort of managed to gain the upper hand again in the country?
I would say so. I mean, exactly what you said. Hezbollah's leading chain of command has been wiped out. Their weapons stockpiles, large parts of them have been destroyed. The morale of the group is low considering the immense destruction in the south. And now, Lebanon has a new president. It's really putting a lot of resources supported by, France and the U.S. into the army, which has begun, a huge effort of disarming Hezbollah, which is one of the president's top priorities, which he said during his speech when he took office.
Hannah Davis in Beirut, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Space is no longer the final frontier these days, but rather a crowded cavalcade of satellites and nations vying for supremacy. The question now is whether anyone will cooperate with anyone else, and in that vein, today the African Union has launched the inaugural African Space Agency in Cairo. It will include the African Union's 55 member states and is only the second multinational agency after the European Space Agency to be inaugurated. I'm joined now by David Whitehouse, space scientist and author. David, thanks for coming back on the show. Before we get to this agency, to back up a bit, David, tell us how active African nations have been in space to date. Many countries do have satellites up there.
That's right. Africa has a substantial space involvement and cooperation. South Africa, Egypt, and many other nations. The Libyans have got a space agency. So they each operate in slightly different ways, and coordination with this new space agency, space nation, multinational agency, is the key, because South Africa has a great deal that it is involved with space, not so much in terms of putting people into space or in missions to the planet, but in using space data to understand its environment, to exploit its environment and manage its resources. So one of the reasons for the new conglomeration is to do that more effectively, because there was a feeling that doing it individually and cooperating with major space nations does not get the best.
And what are its ambitions then? Is it just about cooperation, or do they want to take what African nations do in space in a different direction?
It's both. The problem that many countries have when dealing with, say, you mentioned the European Space Agency, is the European Space Agency is very bureaucratic. There are many opportunities to work with ESA, but when individual nations are each going through those levels of bureaucracy, having now an African Space Agency to take that away from them and do it for them opens up a great deal of resources and time that previously was taken up. So there is that coordination aspect of it. But there is also the feeling that the innovation that, particularly among the young, that is very prevalent in Europe, where people have new ideas and they have places to go to develop those ideas, wasn't quite as advanced in Africa as it could have been. Now, Africa's one of its greatest resources is young. They've got fantastic innovative ideas. They've got access to the technology to develop them and to make them. And it was felt that that really wasn't as effective as it could have been. So the African Space Agency, to develop the young, to incubate business ideas, to develop them into companies, to negotiate cooperation between countries, particularly in the European Space Agency, and also with the United Arab Emirates Space Agency and with Roscosmos in Russia, opens up new frontiers, because there is a critical mass which each individual African country has not reached. But together, they certainly could become one of the major space players in the world.
It is interesting, David, that you mentioned the European Space Agency there and sort of the bureaucracy behind it. They will be cooperating directly with the ESA and also with the UAE. Might they learn from some of those bureaucratic mistakes? Because at the end of the day, there's a similar risk, surely, with 55 nations cooperating at the African Space Agency.
I think they have from what I have seen about the way the African Space Agency is organising, they have learned from the political problems that ESA has, because ESA has, for many years, it was a battle between the Germans, the French, and to a lesser extent the English, the British, as to what they do and which direction they go in. Now, ESA seems to have gotten over that in recent years. It's become much more focused, much more able to have a good relationship with NASA and with the Russians, and it's become much more efficient and has achieved more. That, I think, is a lesson that Africa has learned, is learning, because remember, this space agency is 10 years in the making, and they talked a lot to Europe, less so to America. I think the relationship between the African Space Agency and NASA is a developing one and is yet to reach fruition. But Europe, of course, is its natural space partner, being so close and being a similar type of entity, but much more advanced. So in terms of access to resources, to data, to services, to products that are developing in ESA territory, there are many of these in parallels with Africa. And if you look at the small companies in Africa with good ideas for space, provided they get easy access to data, then give it 10 or 15 years and we could see wonderful things in space coming out of Africa.
David Whitehouse, thank you very much for joining us here on The Briefing. This is The Briefing, and now to some breaking news, because large parts of Spain and Portugal have been hit by a massive power outage, and I'm joined now by our senior foreign correspondent, Carlotta Ribello. Carlotta, what can you tell us? This is a developing story, but quite big news.
Indeed, Chris, and the fact that it has taken out the power, it's a blackout in both countries, so reports suggest that the entirety of mainland Portugal and Spain, the islands of both nations, have not been affected because they're in separate systems. But the fact that it is the two countries suggests that it's not as simple as a fire at a service station or a cable that's malfunctioning. Now, both governments and electricity companies have said that they have not found the cause and they're working towards it. They are investigating whether it could be a cyber attack, but they're not saying it is that. We just don't know. But to give you a sense of the scale, with no electricity, it means that ATMs are stopped working, trains are halted. The airport of Lisbon and Madrid have been described by several outlets, Público in Portugal and El País in Spain, as chaotic because planes have to be grounded to a halt. People are being evacuated from the metro systems across cities because the trains got stuck inside the tunnels. There's no traffic lights, so it's chaos on the streets, and no one really knows why. It is a developing story, and we will know more in the coming hours, hopefully. There's also reports that telecoms are down, so people are able to chat over data-based services such as WhatsApp or FaceTime, but actual phone calls between mobile phones are not working. You can only do that if it's a landline, like fixed, rooted to the ground. It is indeed difficult to say what is in question, and in the next couple of hours more should be apparent. There were initial reports that the outage had extended to other countries, but that has not been verified. So it seems to be Portugal and Spain for now.
For now, and as always with a story like this, presumably we're going to get briefings with more in the coming hours. Do you have any sense of what sort of politicians or anyone has said? Have there been any, I don't know what you have to do in these situations, sort of warning to residents to stay calm, presumably, perhaps to stay home even? There
hasn't been any official guidance. To give you a sense, this happened less than an hour ago. So there's a lot of reaction still happening, because initially people just thought it was a focus thing in their city, in their neighborhood, until it became apparent that it was widespread, not only across one nation, but across two. The governments between the two countries are in communication. The electricity suppliers as well. And as I mentioned, they neither has an official explanation on why this has happened, which indicates it's not just an error, but we shall wait and see. And people, should take caution, particularly those moving and driving around in cities, because without traffic lights, without any of the signage, it is quite dangerous to be out there.
We will have more on this story, most certainly, as it develops. But Carlotta Rebello, Monocle's senior foreign correspondent, thank you very much for joining us. You are listening to The Briefing. And finally on today's show, Monocle's The Chiefs conference in Jakarta last week included among its star guests Najwa Shihab, news anchor and founder of the Narasi News Network. Shihab joined Monocle's own founder and editorial director, Tyler Brûlé, on stage to discuss the founding principles of her media company and how the media landscape has changed since the company began.
I was a broadcast journalist since 2000. So I've been in this industry for 25 years. But in my 17 years, me and my colleagues, we founded Narasi. So it was 8 years ago. Narasi is not just a newsroom. In Narasi, we also try to cultivate civic engagement. We see ourselves not just a media, but quote-unquote a movement. From the very start of Narasi, we've created a space where the young people can express their opinion, to ask questions, to be involved. And that's why in Narasi we have a specific department that cultivates community development. And right now, our registered members for community is almost 300,000 young Indonesians all over the country, even some of them are abroad. We have like a 3C mantra for Narasi. It's for content, collaborations, and community, because we believe you cannot rely on content, especially these days. You cannot sell contents. It's very hard to sell contents. But within the community, we can make people feel that they belong in the stories, that they feel trusted. And I think that's the number one most currency these days in this world, trust. And that's what we're trying to do by building community.
So you're 8 years into this, but if we just go back a little bit, and one thing we were talking about last night was, you talk about being a broadcast journalist, moving into it. Just tell us a little bit what's happened in the broadcast news scene. I mean, of course, it's not just Indonesia, we can talk about an erosion of trust in outlets all over the world, but...
Which is actually interesting because the Ipsos Trustworthy Global Index shows that Indonesian trust in journalists is the highest in the world, which is also something that we can discuss, but please go on.
So I'm curious, how have you seen, let's say, the evolution and maybe the current state of broadcast and that notion that you decided to go and do your own thing? What was not being delivered across cable, across satellite dishes, across the Indonesian archipelago? What was missing?
I think there's this really interesting studies. The key difference between traditional media and the new media is that traditional media don't see engagement as their responsibility. As for the new media, especially the digital platform, we thrive on engagement. So it's very important for us, the digital platforms, to have that connections with the people. We see that as part of our responsibility. For example, I did the same story when I was a broadcaster in Metro TV and now in Narasi. The story is about two young boys who was wrongfully convicted. They were tortured, wrongfully convicted for murder. They spent a few years in prison. And then when they got out, they asked for compensation from the state, and it was denied. When I was doing the story in Metro TV, they were still in the process of the judicial system. So I did the usual thing. I interviewed their lawyers, I interviewed their family, I interviewed the police, and that's it. It stops there. But when we revisit the story in Narasi...
And what was the time span in between Metro and then doing it on Narasi?
I think it was probably 5 years, 4 to 5 years. And when we did the stories again in Narasi, this is after they sued for the compensation and it was denied. We didn't just stop at airing their stories. We then collaborated with the legal aid and then with the crowdfunding. And overnight, we managed to collect donations that would cover their entire school requirements, even if they want to continue as a lawyer. So that shows the different side. That's something I would never do as a broadcaster on TV. My job is done when they're airing. And another example, like during the pandemic, in Narasi, we created this hashtag di rumah aja, stay at home. So other than reporting on the vital informations on pandemic, we host an online concert collecting donations. And I think it got collected almost 14 million rupiah, which is almost $1 billion in over 3 days. For another example, the difference. When we're reporting stories on TV, we would just say, go vote. But in Narasi, go vote, and please sit down at your ballot box, make sure that your votes are counted, and then share that experience to us. So I think the most main difference are that connection, that engagement, that space that we're giving to our audience to make them feel that they can actually do something while they're not just enjoying a content, but they're making action.
Najwa Shihab speaking to our editorial director Tyler Brulé there at this year's edition of Monocle's conference, The Chiefs, in Jakarta. And that is all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Monica Lillis, our researcher was Francesca Jokes, and our studio manager was Mariella Bevan. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.